I'm here today with Gowdy Canon with Canon Connected. And Gowdy, it's great to be with you, and I've enjoyed following your YouTube channel. For those that don't know you, though, why don't you take a moment and introduce yourself and just give us a brief testimony, and then we'll get into what your ministry is all about.
Sure. I was born and raised in South Carolina, fantastic Christian home. When I started college, like a lot of people, I ran from God for a couple of years, but he eventually chased me down and directed me to what was Free Will Baptist Bible College, now Welch College. And after I graduated, I joined a church plant in Chicago with Free Will Baptist, Northwest Community Church. And I was there 17 years, and 13 years in, I met my wife and we got married. And after about 4 years of being married, I decided it was probably, or God really decided, but we decided it was probably time to take her home, And so we left to Chicago to move to Cessna, where she's from. And there weren't any churches open that I was aware of. I was teaching English, as a bivocational pastor at the time, to Chinese children in the middle of the night to me. And so, but then the Bear Point Church came open during that same time, a very God thing. And I pastored there 6 years. And then about 6 years in, what I'm doing now with this podcast and Bible reading plan, it really became something that everybody that was wise around me was telling me I really needed to explore as something more than just a Bible reading plan for my own church, but to make it public. So,
Well, and this is really what our focus is going to be on today is your YouTube channel and your Bible reading plan, but it's so much more than just a Bible reading plan. I've really enjoyed kind of following this from afar, and so for those that aren't familiar with it, why don't you kind of take them through what this is all about and how they can get involved in following this, whether it be next January or whether it be tomorrow.
yeah, during 2020, which anybody that's even remotely more than a few years old remembers, when everything shut down and I was pastoring at Bear Point, 80% of what I was doing was canceled. I couldn't do it. I couldn't go to nursing homes, hospitals, sporting events to support the teenagers in my church. So I was at home a lot thinking, how can I best serve my church? And I'd always had this idea in my mind that it would be interesting to me, because I've read through the Bible a few times and, I'm not an expert in it at all, but I've learned these kind of things, that how interesting would it be to read Psalm 32 and 51 after you read 2 Samuel 11 and 12, when David has his affair with Bathsheba and he has Uriah murdered or killed, and Nathan confronts him, because in real time, he wrote those Psalms, if I understand right, after those events. So I thought, how cool would it be to read those in succession instead of going on to the Absalom story in chapter 13? Just pause right now after chapter 12 and read what David wrote in real time when those events happen. And so from that, it developed into an idea of, like, I wonder how many passages I could do that way, where I could read connections together, things that, even though they're not, side by side in the Bible, in the real world, they more or less were. And I'm not even talking about just prophecies, although that's a huge part of what this plan ended up being. A lot of Old Testament prophecies about Jesus and otherwise, a lot of them in Daniel and that sort of thing. But I was just thinking, how cool would it be to read passages together like that, instead of starting in Genesis, and working through Revelation or doing a chronological plan. So just from that one idea of Psalm 32 and 51, after 2 Samuel 11 and 12, I started looking for, themes to center around. I did not pick the themes first. I was just reading through the Bible and seeing what themes emerged that were separated by time and genre of writing and that sort of thing. One of the most interesting ones that I found, and again, somebody else pointed this out to me, I didn't discover this on my own, but there was a connected idea from the book of Job, where in chapter 9, he says, God alone treads on the waves of the sea. And then you read in Matthew 14 how Jesus walks literally on the water. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. But it went further as this preacher was explaining it. He said, when Jesus got to the men who were in the storm when he was walking on the water in Matthew 14 and other, gospel passages as well, he said, do not fear. And then the English translations usually say, I am he. But what he really said was, I am. That's all he literally said, those two words, I am. And then you read Isaiah 43, and God says, when you go through the waters, rough waters, I will be with you. Do not fear, for I am God. I am your Savior. And so just thinking about, Job saying that God alone treads on the waves of the sea, Jesus, walking on the water, Isaiah 43, God saying, do not fear, I am, Jesus saying that same thing in Matthew 14, based off of, God's giving Moses his name, I am, in Exodus 3. I was like, the first time I read Exodus 3, Job 9, Isaiah 43, and Matthew 14 together, I was just blown away in a way that I hadn't been by a Bible reading in a while. And not that this is, any sort of special way or preferred, but just for me, having, been through the Bible a few times, it was good for me to see that. And so I end up even just literally getting on my face, just like in that moment and thinking, wow, Jesus Christ really is the same God as Exodus 3. And I could have explained that through John 8 or I am the way, the truth, and life and all that. But this was so revolutionary to me that I'm like, I want to develop a reading plan where that sort of thing happens regularly. And so some days it's not that, cool, for a lack of a better word, but every day is connected readings that do absolutely, have things that are in common that I think are good for Christians to see, because you won't always see them if you just read through the Bible in chronological order or in book order. So,
And you kind of touched on this. Some of this would be chronologically connected, but it's really more theme related, or excuse me, theme associated, I guess is the right way to put it. And I know we've probably all seen that graph of the themes in Scripture, Old and New Testament, connected in some way. And from my understanding, your YouTube channel, and I'm not sure what other platforms you may be on, and you can share that. But there's the reading, which your wife does, and then there's kind of a devotional aspect as well, which you do, and those two are connected. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and what other platforms you may be on?
sure. Yes. Well, when the reading plan started, I gave it to my church, just the way it was. And I had no intention of doing a podcast. In my own pride, I was like, there are more podcasts than people in America. I'm not starting one. I'm too good for that. But after about 6 years, my protege, who's ended up being like my best friend now, I'm not much of a mentor to him now, but when we started this, that's what I was doing. I was discipling him, and he's younger, and my wife is younger than I am. And they both were like, you really need to take this mainstream. So I did. So we are on just about any social media or podcast platform you can think of. We're on Apple, we're on Spotify, we're on Instagram, even though there's no, place for, actual, the podcast. We do links through the stories every day, but we're on, again, YouTube, we're on Facebook. We're pretty much everywhere. And yeah, the ideas every day, the scriptures are given, and they're given in every platform. And on YouTube and Facebook, you actually will find links to Blue Letter Bible, which allows you to read all the passages in one place instead of having to flip through. Now, some people prefer to flip through. A lot of people like that. They like the idea, I'm going to go through the Bible, almost like digging for gold. But other people are like, for time and and efficiency, they're like, they really prefer to have it all in one place. So if the reading is Genesis 1 and then Psalm 104 and then Job 38, they'll all be together. And we provide a link for that every day on Facebook and YouTube. The reading plan itself is even found on our website, which is the Canon Connected. That's CANON, thecanonconnected.com, for the whole year if you even wanted to look ahead. But every day we put out the readings for that day and the podcast for that day. And we provide all sorts of links, on many of these sites to try to make it as easy to navigate as possible. And I'll say this too, since I think this is probably where this is going to. I realize that this is, middle of the year or first half of the year. And this kind of thing is usually a January 1st type thing. But this reading plan, this was not a primary design, but it was a secondary benefit to me, is that you can start it and stop it at any point and then pick it back up. And it's not dependent upon the readings that are before. Some of the days do connect from day to day in some manner of speaking, like there were 3 days of creation back in January. But if you started on April the 17th, you would not need January 1st through April 16th for April 17th to make sense, because it's not, chronological or book order. It is theme based. And so that's a benefit. I really, not that I would advocate at all or encourage people to drop out of Bible reading, but if people do get behind or whatever, they don't need to try to do 4 or 5 a day to catch up, because you can just jump in at any moment. So if a person started it, today or tomorrow or 4 months from now, they could start it any day. One of my people, not before when the podcast was around, but one of my people who did it in 2021 when it was first offered, and then he gave a testimony to the church at the end of the year about it, tried to get people to do it in 2022. He said every day is like its own sermon. There's like a main text, and then there's all these supplemental texts that connect to it. And he's like, every day is just like, it's like getting your own sermon. And so he thought that was a huge benefit of it. My sister-in-law told me whenever we were advertising for this, she said, the sermons I remember the best of my life are the ones where the pastor tied the main text to other passages that I had never thought of before. So I can't say it again will be something, mind blowing or amazing every single day, but every single day the idea is, here is how the Bible, it connects to and interprets itself, from Old Testament to New Testament, from poetry to stories to prophecy and that sort of thing. And it really does ultimately prove to me that God wrote all of this, because the coincidences, couldn't possibly happen in my mind. So
And if someone were to go from start to finish, is it a year-long plan? Is it less than a year, more than a year?
That's a good question. It is a year-long plan, so you could start, on April 17th on the readings for that day, and then just do the last 7.5 months or whatever. Or you could, on April 17th, start on day one, because everything on our media is given by days, not by date. I did add in fine print the dates, because the people who were doing it wanted the dates to make sure they were on the right day. But we just have them listed by day. So a person could start on day one on April 17th, and it would be a 365-day venture if they did it all, and they would end on April 16th of next year. And I'll say this too on that note. The goal of the plan was not to get through the Bible in a year. Okay, that was never the goal. It was just to see how passages connect. But since I realized that some people would want to read through every verse in the Bible in a year, every verse is in there at least one time. That was painstaking work, and it was really it took a lot of tedious, frustrating, effort at times. But because I knew people would be like, I want to make sure I read all 31,700 verses of the Bible this year. We made sure every verse is in there one time, and some passages are in there 2, 3, and even 4 times. I think Acts 17 is in there, 4 times, because it connects to 4 different, themes in my mind.
Have there been themes that could you give us an example of a theme that like is maybe reoccurring? And I know we could pick several out, salvation or the birth of Jesus or the second coming, but maybe some themes that we wouldn't necessarily expect that you have found have been reoccurring. Is anything stand out in your mind at the moment?
Well, this one was probably more expected, because the easiest answer would be to see all the things in the Old Testament that are about Jesus, because they are everywhere. I think every syllable in some sense. But on a secondary line, to me, not that it's secondary to our theology, but as far as how I would have expected themes to play out, I've been very surprised at just how much God's sovereignty does come up, because it's in the very beginning with creation. But there is a weeks long of themes that don't connect, by a very specific theme, but they're all under this big umbrella of God's sovereignty. Like there's a day on how God providentially protects people from death, like he did Moses, like he did Jesus, like he did Paul in the book of Acts. All those are connected. And there's one on how the Bible calls God the God of heaven's armies, and how God wins these wars for Gideon, for Hezekiah, for Jehoshaphat. It shows how God, he really is a God of like a warrior God. He fights, political, literal, wars and battles in the Old Testament. And they all just point me back to how God is, in entire control. He's all powerful. He truly is the only sovereign, all powerful, almighty being in the universe. And so, not that I would not have, guessed that at the beginning, but still, just to see it through connections and different sub themes under that one big theme has been very eye opening to me, and it has absolutely affected how I think about God, how I worship, and and how I deal with myself on my bad days. So
So, for someone that wants more information, maybe figure out how they can support your ministry or find out what's coming next from your ministry, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
Well, all of the social media sites have means to connect to me, and because some people prefer Facebook, some people prefer Spotify, but we do have an email address that, and I do check it regularly. I'm only a few months into this thing, so right now I'm like very proactive about everything. And as we discussed beforehand, this is what I'm trying to do full time now. Not that I ever thought that this would be the kind of thing I would want to do, but I do it. So the Canon Connected, same as our website, but it's at gmail.com. That's the CANON connected at gmail.com. If you email that, I will respond within a couple of hours, probably at most, unless it's nighttime. But I am definitely, we get a lot of PMs through our Facebook page. And there's even every once in a while, somebody will comment on Spotify or YouTube and that sort of thing. But I'm very vigilant right now in responding to things because every now and then there's a mistake or something too. Something's not working right. We're working through the technical bugs as well. So, but yeah, the emails maybe the best way, or the Facebook PM through the Canon Connected webpage. But everything on the sites is updated daily, and we are definitely about trying to keep the advertising and the publicity going because we're new and we're small. This is nothing like the Bible recap yet, and it's very small, very low key. But we're working towards trying to make it as mainstream as possible. So.
Any insight as to some other things that you're working on or what might be next? I think about, okay, we're going to do this first year. What's next year look like? Those kind of things.
Well, this is what my mind is telling me at this point. And by the way, I want to go back just for a second because you mentioned something about this. I want to make sure that's explained too. That my wife does the readings for people. You asked about, you said something about that. Because this what made me think of that is how she's like, if you do this again next year, she's like, you're gonna have to find a different reader. Because she's doing all the readings, through our technology here on the computer, and we're putting them on YouTube, and hopefully eventually we'll put her readings on Spotify and Apple as well. So she's doing the readings every single day, and it's always 80 to 120 verses, or sometimes it's more. But I've thought about, and that this is what jogged that in my memory, is that I've thought about doing it next year with 365 completely different connections, and I've got about 9 or 10, which is such a tiny percentage of what 365 is. But I've got about 9 or 10 that I've taken notes on because my pastor that I sit under now, he doesn't aim for his sermons to be exactly like this reading plan, but just by the very nature of preaching, he points out connections, and so I'm like taking notes, and so I'm like, that's not my reading plan, so we'll have to do that one for next year. So I truly am thinking about doing a season 2, so to speak, instead of just allowing it to be one thing one time and people can go back to it. But for to try to again to expand and marvel at the idea that this is gonna be a bottomless well of a topic of the Bible, because we're never going to understand all the connections. We're never going to see them all, but we can keep digging and we can keep trying to see new ones. And I really am adamant about not trying to find some that aren't there and trying to force it. I want them to be natural. I want them to be obvious and things that I can defend, with theological integrity. But I do think there are so many, like you said, that picture, I can't think of the name of the guy who developed, but 64,000, lines on the connection in that picture that's been shown around Facebook. So I think I want to do at least two seasons of this, 2 years of it, and then at the end of year 2, if we want to try to do it again with a different angle, or maybe just let it be and let people check out one or both of those seasons. But I really have enjoyed this so much. The technical part of it drives me crazy, and it may send me to early retirement. I don't know, but the actual podcasting part of it, the explaining of the connections, because that's what I do. The devotional part of it you mentioned, because my wife was like, some days she would read it and be like, I don't understand what the connections you're trying to make here. So doing the podcasting part of it has been a joy. So I would love to do 365 more of these. And I'm already over 200 into the year. I mean, as far as shooting them, I'm way ahead. So I've been doing it a while, and it's not wearing on me at all. It brings me life. It really is something I feel like God has probably called me to at this point. But so maybe a different season with all new connections, and maybe some of them the same, but probably a lot of new ones next year.
Well, thank you for sharing what God's shown you with us, and I would encourage our listeners to check out your YouTube channel and your other social media platforms And we wish you all the best, and we really appreciate, again, your ministry and what God's called you to do.
Thank you so much, Daryl. I appreciate it. I appreciate you too very much.